only really efficient if, the vaporization if you don't have any brood. Because it does not kill the mites under the cactus. Like I said earlier, Mite Away Quick Strips is the only treatment that you can do that kills mites under the cactus, 96% of them. And let's see, Hop Guard, I don't care, it's an icky, gummy, runny type of treatment, and I didn't have a whole lot of success with it. It did kill a few mites, but I don't think it was very, and I've heard in other states from some other master beekeepers in Pennsylvania and Michigan and some of those areas that they didn't have any success with it. So that would be one I would tell you kind of save your money on, try something else. Apivar, I've had good luck with that stuff. That's Amitraz. Amitraz is the original ingredient on flea collars. That's where they came from. Don't put a flea collar in your hive. But it does work. And it will kill it, but it's a 6 or 7 week time span that you have to do that. And if you do use it, my advice would be after you put the strips in, about once a week, go in there and move the strips. Move them to between other frames. If you don't, you'll end up with indentations in your frames where so much of the chemical is absorbed, the bees won't fool with it, and probably will never build a comb there again. But if you move it around, it definitely works, and it kills 96% or so of the mites. But it's expensive. Most of these, other than oxalic acid, are not cheap. What you do want to stay away from is check mite, Coumaphos, that's bad. Most people don't even sell it anymore. I think you can still buy Apistan, which is fluvalinate, which kills a few mites, but bees developed a resistance to check mite after a few years that they were using it. So if somebody wants to make you a deal on it, you need to pass it up. And I had a guy bring several strips to a bee meeting that had Chinese on the outside of it. So I didn't even ask him where he got it. I didn't want to know. So always follow the manufacturer's directions. If you don't have the directions, has everybody heard of the Honeybee Health Coalition? That should be in your bookmarks on your search engine. Honeybee Health Coalition. They have every treatment that you can use listed on there. The best times to use it and how to use it. Very good source. Probably one of the best sources that you'll find, if not the best. And here's what bees do. This is what we're working about. This is what spread diseases. It's called prophylaxis. Everything a bee does in the hive, they do with their mouth, as far as moving things and feeding each other. They communicate with their antenna. So if one bee develops a virus or a disease, it's not long till they all have it. So remember that when you go to feed and you're doing different things. Now here's something we need to understand as we go into winter. Clusters. If you're going to combine some hives to make a bigger cluster, doubling the number of bees only gives you a 58% more surface area. And if you've got healthy bees and a healthy queen, and you can see what the cluster looks like, I would recommend putting them in a nuke rather than a 10-frame hive. They'll have better exposure to the food. You can see right here, this cluster here will touch honey just about anywhere it goes. And when one bee in the cluster, or so many few bees in the cluster touches a honey food source, they all share. So they're all going to survive. Here's another example right here. These bees, but we can have a problem right here on this one. If these bees move left to these 2 frames, they're going to run out of food, aren't they? So what do you think you need to do to that? You need to do a little rearrangement, don't you? So think about that when you're doing your inspection and you're deciding whether you want to feed or not. I would take some of these frames and move them up here and just try to get them all over in one area, or I might, this is too big of a cluster and they need a little more food, but I might even put them in a nuke if they're a little bit smaller. And I'll show you a picture of a nuke here. This is what happens. We go through, we see the cluster like this. There's not much these bees can do that they're not going to starve. So they need lots of food, don't they? There's no way they can move. You need to think about this when they're in there. If you go over here and look at these bees, they're so small, they're gonna have a problem feeding anywhere. Right here. They move down, they might get lucky and go over here, but if you do a nuke this way, how we change it, look what happens. Just about any way they go in there, they're gonna touch the food. They're not gonna starve. This is so important, and I wish I'd learned this when I was starting out. This is an attachment I have for my camera where I can see the cluster in the hive without having to open it up in the wintertime. It's called forward-looking infrared, a flare attachment. I'm cheap by nature, so this was the first generation, and I bought it after they came out with the second generation, and I got it for about half price. That's the way I do it. But you'll see where the bees are. These bees, I'm happy about that. I don't have to do anything. They're down there in the bottom, and they got a full deep up here of food on them. These bees here, I'm worried about. So what did I do here? What do you think I did to these bees? I put a candy board on. Yeah, we don't want to move the boxes right now because when they're in their hibernation, we don't want to really take the chance of breaking the cluster. If we do that, they're going to die. So we're going to really be careful with it. And here's a picture of one. This one's in so-so shape. They haven't moved up. And if I had to time date this, what time of year would you think this would be? February, yeah, pretty good.
Good job.
Good guess. Because half the bees are up, they're moving up, and they're going to go into the box, and they're probably already laying brood. And this brood, this size here tells me this cluster has expanded. Look at the difference in the size here and the difference here. See that? And there's a cheap way you can do this. It's called a stethoscope. You can take a stethoscope and put it down on the hive and tap on it and move it around, and your bees, you can hear it just, don't go smacking it. Just tap a little bit, and they'll roar, and you'll be able to hear where they are. And you can tell where in the hive they are, and if they're in the top box, you might want to put a candy board or some type of feed on there. Food necessity is, when bees emerge from the cell, the first thing they do is go eat. They got to do something to get their body going. And ample food supplies ensures that their system stays in order. Bees have an orderly system from when they go from emerging as a young bee until they die out in the field. And during this time that they age, they stay in a sequence to where their glands, as their glands develop, their jobs in the hive correlate with the development of their glands. It's so important that happens. In other words, their hypopharyngeal glands are the ones that feed, they produce food. Mandibular gland produces with the hypopharyngeal gland, royal jelly. But at a certain time of the year, after they get a certain age, the mandibular gland quits producing the clear substance of royal jelly and starts producing alarm pheromone. So these bees are too old to produce good queens. And honey is not the only part of the food regimen to produce healthy bees, because you need pollen and you need everything that a bee needs to produce carbohydrates and protein to produce babies. And that's what we're going to try to feed for to make sure they make it through the winter. Now, this is winter bees like I was talking about a while ago. Without winter bees, we've got a real problem. Our bees are likely not going to make it. This was really one of the big topics at EAS this year, and it has been for the last 3 or 4 years. So when brood development wanes in the fall, emerging worker bees have less larvae to feed, and therefore begin to tank up on pollen and fat. These are the bees that are turning into winter bees. And their abdomen turns to from almost empty, even the air sacs in their abdomen, which are empty space, that helps them fly when they're foragers, and then their honey gut expands and takes room in there. All this room in there turns into vitellogenin and fat. That's what they store in there. They're not great big bees or longer bees. They're just storing more protein to last through the winter. Now, low numbers of winter bees will result in the hive slower to develop in the spring. This is what I'm talking about when I say your spring honey management begins in the fall. If you've got good winter bees going in, you'll have trouble keeping them from swarming, and that's a good thing. That's what we want. Pollen substitutes don't produce the same results as real pollen, but they're better than nothing. So is feeding. I mean, some people say don't feed your bees. Well, if they don't have any food, you don't feed them, they're going to die, no matter what. So here's a good question. This is a good book too, if you guys want to get a free book to download. It's 1,000 Answers to Beekeeping Questions. You can get it free online. And it's by C.C. Miller, and he's the original answer man for the American Bee Journal. This guy was an MD, and he got so enthralled with bees, he quit his medical practice and started studying honeybees. I call that calling, is what I call it first. And he says, when is the best time to feed the bees? The best thing is to never feed them, but let them gather their own stores. One question I always ask myself when I go to get honey off the hive is, do I need this honey more than the bees do? Everybody understand that? If they need it more than I do, I'm not taking it. Because there's nothing I can feed them that's going to equal the quality of the honey they have on the hive. And the best time, the feeding is right now. And like Larry said, he made a real good point, 1-to-1. The bees will use that to raise babies. 2-to-1, they'll store. You can even go 3-to-1 if you want to, but you have to watch temperatures. If it gets too cool when you're doing 3-to-1, it's difficult for the bees to work it and manipulate it. Now, if you want them to store 1-to-1, you need to think about this. 1-to-1 is what? 50% water, isn't it? How much water is in honey? 18%. So before those bees can turn that 1-to-1 into winter food making honey, they got to remove 32% of the water that's in there. So think about that in your timing of when you feed, whether you want to feed 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. Right now it's 1-to-1. My weak hives, when I did my inspection for my treatments, I noticed a lot of the weak hives did not have a lot of food in there. This was a couple of weeks ago. Now they're getting fed 1-to-1. And be careful when you do that this time of year. Make sure that you keep an entrance reducer. I don't actually put an entrance reducer. I put number 8 mesh across the entrance and then cut a little hole in there for the bees to come and go, and that way they can ventilate and they can do a good job of keeping air flowing through the hive, and they can still keep out robbers. Robbing can happen so easy this year, this time of year. And what I recommend is, I carried around, and Curtis saw it the other day, I've got a bucket of water in my cart and a sponge. If I spill any honey anywhere or syrup or anywhere around there, I'll wipe it up. Because it won't take long for scout bees to find that, and if that's a weak hive, they're going to rob it. One couple I know over there in my area, they just harvested their honey, and they wanted to get the stickies cleaned up, and they took them out and leaned them up against the hives. Guess what happened? They all got robbed. Not only by their bees, by the feral bees. I mean, this attracts bees for miles and miles and miles. So be careful when you feed this time of year. Even on your hive tools, don't lay them around, they got honey on them. That aroma will attract bees. And anybody know how to recognize a robber bee scouting your hives out when you're inspecting that? Have you ever had your hive open on top and you're looking, or frame setting down here, and these bees come along and they buzz intensely, back and forth, zigzagging, looking around? These are bees that are scout bees from another hive, and they're looking for a way to fly in and get past the guard bees. That's what they're doing. So learn to recognize that. And when you see that time of the year, that tells me too, the flow is over and I need to be extra careful. Anybody ever seen bees do that? Yeah. And it's an old mistake that they're doing it too. You think, boy, these bees are really mad about something, but they're not. They're just keeping the airspeed up. I'm a retired pilot. They're keeping that airspeed up so they can shoot in an opening anytime they can find it and get by the guard bees. And once the robbing starts, it's almost impossible to stop it. It really is. It's better to prevent it than try to stop it after it starts. Here's what I was just talking about, 2-to-1 syrup is 33% water. 1-to-1 is 50% water, so think about that. If you get into October or whatever and it's still warm enough to feed and your bees need a little food, need a little carbs, then even think about 3-to-1, 3 parts sugar to 1 part water. If it gets heavier than that, it's a little bit difficult to feed through the jars. It doesn't work very well. When should you feed? Low on stores. Hive may have been robbed. What does robbing look like in a hive on your comb? What does it look like?
Comb is rough, but uncapped everything.
Jagged edges. Anybody seen that? You see that on your, yeah, real jagged edges. You've got little bits on the bottom board of wax. That's robbing that's going on. And hopefully when you see that, your queen is still alive, because one of the things that usually happens when heavy robbing starts is your queen will get killed in that hive that's being robbed. They've got no use for her, and she's the enemy. The negatives of feeding is clogging, filling the brood comb. That's usually not going to happen this time of year. I noticed when I put my treatments in a couple of weeks ago, I started that most of my food stores are going down. Is that the case with most of you guys? It's not disappeared yet. Some are almost empty, but most of the food stores that several weeks ago when I went in there and I was moving frames around and I had all these heavy frames of nice white capped honey in there, a lot of them are gone now. So they're using that up. And that tells me too, there's not a lot of food out there. So that may be a sign that you want to feed. Types of feeding: tank feeders, candy boards, spring feeders, entrance feeders, community feeders. Community feeders, if you don't have room to feed 200 or 300 yards away, then don't use community feeders. That'll start robbing. I learned that the hard way. And it's like a feeding frenzy of sharks when you get that done. And they're all just trying to get at that. And that's just bees looking for food is what it is. You can fill empty comb. Anybody ever done that? You can take 3-to-1 actually and a little paintbrush and brush it in empty comb and use that for feed. It works. But you'll be surprised how much syrup will go into one side of comb. Usually about 1.5 quarts, believe it or not. And sponges, baggies, pie pans, there's a lot of different feeding methods. I won't really get into that. Raw sugar is pretty good. That works all right. They don't have a system to really digest that as well as processed sugar like syrup, fondant, candy. Honey, if you feed honey, try to make it light honey and your honey. Don't go out and buy honey and feed it to your bees. Spores of all kinds of diseases exist in honey, and you can just wipe out your hive that way. And corn syrup, anybody feed corn syrup? Good. I quit feeding corn syrup about 6 or 7 years ago, and most of my nosema is gone. I think it's bad for bees. I know it's bad for us, and I think it's bad for our bees too. Raw sugar, if you're going to feed raw sugar, I kind of do that as a last resort. I run out of fondant or candy or whatever, and then you can take a emery shim. You know what a shim is? Yes, sir.
You said you quit feeding because of GMO?
GMO as well as, I think high fructose corn syrup kind of induces dysentery.
Fructose versus sucrose.
What?
Your fructose versus sucrose.
Right, yeah, high fructose corn syrup, it goes through a chemical reaction to produce the fructose in that. And sucrose, the bees have to convert into fructose and glucose. My experience has been with high fructose corn syrup is that it does induce dysentery. And of course, bees clean things up with their mouth. And then dysentery is type of disease, and that spreads that throughout the hive. And if bees cannot get out and defecate outside the hive, they start inside the hive, and that turns into a real mess. The immune system depletes, and I think that the theory is they're more exposed to Nosema ceranae when something like that happens.
One thing, John, that we've noticed, we've fed both, obviously, And, you can build a lot more bees on sucrose than you can fructose. They don't, you don't.
Oh,
get the
that's
same-
true.
You don't get
That's
the
true.
same
Yeah,
buildup on
yeah,
fructose.
Curtis is right. Yeah, they will build faster on sucrose than they will fructose. Especially high fructose corn syrup. And always use an emery shim. Does everybody know what an emery shim is? It's just a 3/4 inch strip, the same size as your box. I've got a picture up there in a minute, and it gives you a space to feed. You can take newspaper, put it on your frames. I like to spray a little water on it, poke a few holes in it, and then just pour sugar on top. And try to figure out where the bees are, and don't dawdle while you're doing this. You know, kind of peek under there and look where the bees, then get everything ready and do it and get the hive closed back up. Don't freeze them to death while you're putting extra food on there. That happens. It's easy to happen. This is similar to an emery shim. This is one of those ventilation shims that you can buy. You know, it's got ventilation holes in it. An emery shim would just be solid like this and 3/4 of an inch. These are community feeders right here. This is an in-hive feeder. I like these. You can set these this time of year on top of your frames and take an empty box and put it over that and just feed all you want. I even made a little tote box that goes in my cart that I can hold 24 jars as I go around and just swap the jars out, change the lids and swap them out. Here's a shim. And this is, if you beekeep long enough, you get equipment that rots. So this is an old deep box that I cut up and made shims out of. I put an old blade on my table saw and just cut 3/4 inch shims out. Now I've got a big stack of them out in my barn, and it works very well. You can put a sheet of wax paper in there and put fondant on it. You can put raw sugar. You can put candy from a candy board. Here's something I don't do anymore. This is honey. And feeding honey to bees, dark honey. Light honey's okay. Dark honey is hard on bees because if it gets to the point they can't go out and defecate, they have to store it in their midgut or their rectum. And the dark substances in here are normally things bees can't digest. So it remains in their system. I'll show you a picture here in a minute what happens. This is my stuff. This is what I did. I make these out of OSB. It took me a little while to figure out I could make these a little bit smaller if I wanted to. I don't know why I make them so big. But they work really nice. I meant to bring a few and give them away, but I didn't do it. I say I've got maybe 50 cents or $1 a piece in these things. And you can make this to hold 4 jars if you wanted to. Very easy to make. That sits on the top of the frames with an empty box on top of it. This is an overfeeder I got that I do. I've got 3 of these. But I put these on my farm about 300 yards from my hives. And to the bees, it's just a food source that's out there. The way I learned to move it 300 yards is I put it out in my backyard once, and it was stinging me and the dog and my wife and everybody else around there, so I don't do that anymore. And they were fighting each other and gathering on the outsides of the hives, so. Liquid feeding, we just went through that. 2-to-1 or 1-to-1, we talked about that. 2-to-1 is for storage, 1-to-1 is for production. Remember that. And when you reduce or dissolve your sugar, just get the water warm enough to dissolve it. You don't have to boil it. And a good rule of thumb is to put a tablespoon of lemon juice in there. If you do 2 or 3 gallons, and that lemon juice will cause like an invert reaction and help preserve that sugar water. It won't mold, it'll last a little bit longer without putting it in the refrigerator.
Do you use apple cider vinegar?
Pardon?
Apple cider vinegar?
Yeah, vinegar, anything that's acid, anything that's acid. And another thing people are doing now to help with nosema are putting a few drops of tea tree oil in there to try to fight the fungus. Nosema is caused by a fungus. Nosema ceranae is, but I wonder about this because bees actually use the fungus to make bee bread, and I don't want to destroy that fungus. But I've had some very good beekeepers tell me that they've had they cut down the instances of nosema by adding a little tea tree oil to their syrup. I don't know where they get it. Where do you get yours, Curtis?
Loran.
Where?
Loran oils.
Loran oils. I would get a good oil. Yeah, I don't think I would go to Walmart or somewhere and buy it.
Lori Bee has it as well.
Pardon?
Lori B.
Lori B has some? Okay. That's, everybody was talking about that at HAS and EAS, you know, about helping to, because Nosema is one of the bad things that's kind of reappearing. And Nosema cerani, which is the bad type, can even affect your queen. It'll cause instances of supersedure, and you look in your hive and you think, wow, I've got all this larva and everything, why are they trying to supersede this queen? And more than likely, you've probably got a Nosema problem. And you wouldn't be able to tell that yourself other than the indications of a supersedure cell and maybe K-wing. K-wing is another sign of Nosema. We know K-wing is a sign of K-wing virus. It's a sign of tracheal mites and also a sign of Nosema. Yes, sir.
You use 2 or 3 drops to a quart or to a gallon or what? Keep
What
it-
do you do, Curtis? Hey,
It's
thanks.
real precise.
Well, most people aren't, you
Oh,
know.
probably,
My tablespoon of lemon juice is,
yeah, probably, I would say if you was gonna try to mix it up like that, to make a gallon, we make our own Honey Bee Healthy, and that's what we use it in. We'll probably put, I don't know, a couple tablespoons, or teaspoons.
teaspoons, that's what I thought. Yeah,
Uh,
teaspoon or
And then
two.
blend it,
You know, start
blend
out
it in a
easy.
blender.
Right, yeah, start out easy and kind of sneak up on it. That's a good way to do it.
Teaspoon to how much?
To a
A
gallon.
couple teaspoons to a gallon.
To a gallon.
And then, of course, you're not gonna put, you know, you'll use just very little bit of that gallon that you made up into your syrup. Even a
Right.
smaller amount. What you're doing is
Yeah.
you're making your solution to put in, you know, then you put a teaspoon or 2 of that in.
Yeah, if you
quart
don't
jar.
do the solution first, it kind of
Separate.
floats around, yeah, separate.
You gotta emulsify it with a blender.
Yeah, emulsify, that's the word I was looking for, emulsify.
What are you actually putting in there, Curtis? Inside that, with the tea tray, you say a solution? You're putting what?
We use tea tree, lemongrass, spearmint, and wintergreen.
Okay. And then you mix that up, and that's what you just add with it.
Yeah, it's basically homemade Honey Bee Healthy.
Yeah.
And it don't cost near the price.
Yeah.
And this is number 3 here, let's see, 1, 2, 3, number 4. Bear in mind, this is what we need. The bees are gonna tell us what's going on in the colony, you know, when you look in there. And bear in mind what mode the bees are experiencing and consider that. And what I was talking about earlier when you go through, if they're not raising a lot of drones, if they're not storing a lot of food, then they're in the doldrums and they're in the decrease, and that's the time that you need to do the mites, because why? The mite numbers are gonna go up as the number of bees go down. And that's the time that the bees are gonna really suffer if you don't do something. Bee candy recipes, I won't stick to these. Have you got copies of these, Larry? If you don't want, I'll leave them up here, you can take photos of them and share them. These are some good recipes, there's a bunch of them.
I think they're gonna be on our website, aren't they?
They might
Yeah, I
be.
can put them on there.
Erica's getting them on, we'll put it on our website.
Okay. I'll get them all up here. There's a bunch, I've collected these over the years from different people, and all of them work, you know, you just gotta combine. This is what I use for a candy board. Most of the recipes before that were candy, and that's a homemade deal. I'll rip a 2 or 4 down, that's a 1.5 inch with a piece of plywood, and it's got a hole in the middle. And you pour your candy in here, and when it hardens, you turn it upside down and set it over your bees. And the good thing about a candy board is no matter where the cluster is, they're gonna come in contact with the candy on top. And a lot of the older beekeepers and more experienced beekeepers always use that. Here's more candy. When you do the fondant, it says stir to 255 or 260. Some people will say, well, you're going to produce HMFF, hydroxymethylfurforaldehyde. There's a mouthful in it. And that's kind of a toxic version of sugar, but most of the research that I've read on that it's very, very, very small, the toxin is in that. And this is just, when you get the 255 or 60, you're just actually making hardball candy almost, where you boil sugar and water until it gets to a certain temperature. Don't substitute candy bars and feedings for natural. Don't rob your bees unless you can take care of getting them back with some good food. Fall honey is one thing I don't usually go after. You know, I have, because I love aster hunting, and that's what we get in the fall. That's my favorite hunting, but I try not to. I'm telling myself, don't do that, don't do that, but I end up doing it anyway, so. And, this is something that a lot of people, you hear, you'll hear the scuttlebutt. When a hive has died in the spring and dead bees are found in the bottom board and head first in the comb near food, this is, like I said earlier, it's due to a weakened condition caused by varroa. And a lot of people say, oh, they wouldn't leave the brood to go to the food. Well, let me tell you, they'll eat that brood, because that is food. That's survival. That's what bees are about. They'll cannibalize the brood if they have to. So if you're having hives die and they have that scenario, then you didn't do varroa very well. You didn't do a varroa treatment very well. And pollen patties. Anybody do pollen patties in the fall? Do winter patties, spring? They work very well, actually. You'll build your brood up. Just don't get anxious with them and put them on too soon. You can get your bees building before they're ready to build.
Be ready with feed if you do.
Do what?
So be ready with feed.
Yeah. They will go big time. And here's something that a friend of mine started last year. This is fondant you can buy already made up. And it's vegan too, vegan fondant. And you can take a scoop of it out, you can flatten it out into a patty or whatever you want to do with it. Put it on a piece of wax paper and turn it upside down and lay it on the top bars. And he swears by it. Now this guy's a very good bee. This box right here is 22 pounds and it costs $40. And it's from Websteront.com.
Is that like they do cakes and stuff?
That's exactly what it is. And don't get the color, this is white, don't get the color stuff. That's got food dye and all that, the bees are very sensitive in their digestive systems, and you can get the white. That $40 is not a lot, and that's 22 pounds. And that would do a lot of feeding. What I don't know about this is shelf life. One thing I do know about candy and candy bars and stuff like that, what they don't eat this year, I crumble it up or break it out of there and put it in bags and put it in the freezer and use it again next year. I don't know how this stuff would last, but I'm gonna try it. I've got one order. Go on.
You got any problem mixing pollen sub with your sugar patty?
No, but you don't want to do too soon. I'm gonna show you here in a minute why, okay? Yeah, you can mix sugar with it. I think they will take pollen patties better if you do mix a little sugar with it. Some of the new pollen patties now, I think, have sugar in them. And that's why bees prefer them over other pollen patties. But don't feed brood building patties in the winter. Brood building patties go after bees start taking cleansing flights in the spring. Say, well, not really the spring, in February. If you don't see bees coming out occasionally when the sun's warm and taking cleansing flights, they'll go out and fly around and come right back in. If they're not doing that, don't put brood building patties on there yet. Just wait. And here's the reason. These are worker bees. This is the summer condition of their rectum right here. This is like their large intestines is what this is. If you feed them winter patties or dark honey that they can't digest certain substances in there, and in winter patties, if you look at the ingredients, it's called inerts. And if the ash is the #1 ingredient that you want a very, very, very small amount of ash in there. Ash is formed when they put the patties together. They don't dump ash in there, okay? But here's what happens. They can't digest that and they end up storing it in the rectum. Look at that. I mean, that makes me uncomfortable. And you expect bees to sit there all winter like this, it won't happen. And you've induced it, they'll end up defecating in the hive, and then prophylaxis sets in and they start cleaning up, passing around the diseases that one or two may have. Now they've all got it. So we got to stay ahead of it. This is a great photo. I think it's in Mark Winston's book, believe it or not, over here, Honeybee Biology. Here's the way I feed some open pollen feeding. The thing about pollen, and I'm sure some of you guys have experienced this pollen, artificial pollen, is either they take it or they don't. I don't see much in between on that. You know, I've had them just totally ignore it. And then other times they go after it like this. They come out drenched with it, covered with it.
Our neighbor says they don't ignore it, they get in his corn for his cows,
Do what?
get in his corn dust for his cows.
Oh, yeah, that's my, yeah,
Neighbor
I
does
have all
also.
these
Yeah, says,
neighbors.
can you call your bees home, please?
Yeah, that's, I've had that, so my oldest neighbor came by one day, come here, you gotta go look at this. And of course, they grind their own corn, you know, and they mix a little sorghum with it or whatever. And I've got a video, I don't have it up here. I walked in his feed shop and it must have been 10,000 bees in there. And they were just helping themselves, and you could see them shooting out, headed back to my property. And he said, can you do anything about this? And I said, well, I'll go talk to them. Didn't do much good, so. Anyway, this is what my nukes look like in the spring. This was taken right after the spring had started and the leaves had appeared on the trees on an overwinter nuke. So people that tell you you can't overwinter a nuke, they don't know what they're talking about. Look at this, that was amazing. And of course, I put that in a 10 frame, and this hive produced 6 or 7 supers a day. And you can tell they're ready to go. This is my information. If anybody wants any of this stuff, if you'll email me, I'll send you a copy of it. I do that everywhere I go. And, dude, I have questions. We need to talk about this and get some comments on things. And like I said, at EAS this year, the big subjects were nosema and causing supersedure cells. And guess what else they've discovered causes supersedure cells? Fungicides that they're spraying out there. And you go in and it's kind of disheartening because you got bees everywhere, and I'm sure Curtis has seen this, and you pull out a frame and there's all kinds of brood and larvae and there's supersedure cells in there, and you say, what's going on? There's nothing wrong with this queen. And there's things that these pesticides, and there are 22 different pesticides listed in categories. Even where molluscicide that kills molars. But, you know, we're worried about synergistic effects of putting down herbicides and fungicides together. That produces a nasty substance. And it doesn't really affect the bees directly, but it gets in the water. Things like that, little puddles or whatever. And it does affect, once it's in the water and they bring it back, it affects the babies more than it does the adults. It kills them. And I've seen brown larvae, I'm looking at brood, and think it's European foul brood, but it's not. It's just bad, nasty stuff out there they're bringing in. And there's not much we can do about that other than stay ahead of what's going on in the hive and try to keep our bees big, moving, and healthy. Some of the other things they talked about, let's see here. Oh yeah, they've discovered, and I think most of us already know this, that soybeans are a pretty good honey crop, and they are. But you need to get your bees off before they spray, especially dicamba, if you're doing bees around soybeans. It would be nice if we could talk to the soybean growers and let them know they've discovered that if our bees work their soybeans, they get a 3% to 7% increase in production.
How much?
3 to 7%. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's pretty good. That's a few dollars right there. 3% to 7%. Yeah, if you've got several thousand acres, that's a pretty good increase. And another thing they've discovered, you know, I've hooped and hollered about corn and the neonics on that, but research has shown that once the corn has planted, most of the danger is gone from neonics. It's not as systemic through the plant as you might think, because bees, it's not a big source of pollen for bees. But I have seen some, have you always seen him bring them in lately, the off-colored white pollen? It's probably corn pollen more likely than not. They still don't like to see that, you know, because I know it's like when I was a kid and they talked about cigarettes, and they had all this research going on, and one fellow told me, he said, well, maybe I can't prove they're not good for, they're gonna kill you, but they're not doing you any good. And that's the way I look at this, all these products that are going on out there that they're putting down. And I don't know about your area, in my area, they don't just use small tanks, they got tanker loads of chemicals coming in. And they're gonna spray you, and that's fine, because that's part of the system, you know. But we need to adapt, and we need to work with them to help them understand what our bees need and what it's doing to the bees, because we need our bees, and I'm sure everybody knows that. Yes, sir.
What was the chemical that you were talking about they were spraying on the bees?
Of what?
The chemical or?
Dicamba. Dicamba is a herbicide, broadleaf, or no, it's a broad spectrum herbicide. And they've discovered now that it drifts, has a bad tendency to drift.
They'll pick up and move.
Yeah, and get in the water and kill vegetation down the road after you spray it. They came out with it, this is another product from my friends at Bayer. They came out with it because Roundup was not we had weeds that were becoming Roundup resistant. And the Roundup wasn't killing pigweed and some of these other weeds out there. And I thought it was funny, my neighbor was out there, he's got 1,000 acres, he's out there with a hoe chopping pigweed, way out in the field there. On the horn and wave to it. But dicamba is the worst I can think of. And they had a analogy on synergistic effect. There's two terms, one's called synergistic, one's called antagonistic. Antagonistic, if you mix two substances together, it produces a substance less lethal than the two that before you mixed them. Synergistic means if you mix two substances together, it produces a substance much more lethal than the two substances by themselves. And the analogy was 5 and 5 equals 4 for the antagonistic effect, and 5 plus 5 equals 25 for the synergistic effect. So, you know, it's something as beekeepers we've got to look out for. But as far as winter management is concerned, if you do your homework right now, you get your bees ready, and also call and combine colonies. That, you know, you've got small colonies that aren't making it, and they're kind of what I call spinning their wheels. Anybody ever seen that? You say, what's wrong with these bees? It's probably the queen. She's got something wrong with her. She didn't mate right. She may have a disease. But be careful when you unite bees for the winter. Don't stick a bunch of sick bees with some good healthy bees and kill them too. It's easy to do that. You know, at the Master Beekeeper dinner up at EAS this year, we were sitting around and everybody was eating nice food, and one of the guys stood up and talked, and he said, you know what? He said, I think we need to take account of how many bees we've killed at this table. And I would think that would probably be in the thousands and millions maybe. Because you're gonna kill some bees, and if you don't learn from it, shame on you. You know, don't keep doing it. It breaks my heart to do that. It's a bad feeling going out there. You have a hive that's booming one week and you come back out and all the bees are dead. And when does this happen? It's gonna happen next spring. It's gonna happen to people here in this room. Probably, hopefully not me. And I'm trying right now to get everything ready, but who knows? Got any more questions? Roy? Go ahead.
You was talking about the sugar patty. What I was planning on doing was be a patty that goes all the way across the hive. That's gonna be half with pollen sub added and half without it, so that free choices. You got any problem with that?
I don't know about bees differentiating.
They don't.
Yeah, I know they do to a point, but do you think it gets to the point where they don't differentiate from it? Are they going to starve because they don't want the protein from the pollen and they need the sugar? The adults need more carbs. It's a catch-22 thing. The adults need the carbs and the babies need the protein. So,
They've got both.
yeah, I know, but in nature it doesn't work that way. wondering how bees would differentiate and separate them.
Well, last fall I tried this just to see, and at first, I was trying to figure out what they wanted. So at first, they was all, every bee in there was on the side with the pollen sub in it. So after 6 weeks, I decided, all right, all of it's gonna have the pollen sub in it instead of without it. Well, pretty quick after that, I went and looked, and all the bees was on the other side.
They go to the sugar.
They went to just the sugar.
Well, here's my take on that, is they started raising brood. That's why they needed the pollen. It got to a point where the weather changed things. In the spring, if the weather, we get several days of bad weather, bees change their whole mindset on what they're doing. They go into another mode. And they may have gone from raising babies, and they will actually cannibalize and eat babies in order not to feed them, and then started eating the sugar because they had more adults than they did. That's normally what happens in that situation. You understand?
Well, I'm putting it to where that bee knows what he needs, so that's.
Hopefully,
where he's going.
but if you got it on one side or the other and the cluster's over here, sometimes they won't get over there. But maybe if you mix it together, it'll work, you know. Let me know how it works, and I hope nothing happens to your bees.
Well, it worked good last year.
Okay? Yeah, how many have done something that worked good one year and didn't work good the next? I like to aggravate, Roy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, John, your thoughts on, single deep or double deeps overwintering?
Overwintering, I know some good beekeepers that do a good job with single deeps, but most of the people that are not really experienced, they tried what Kent told them last year. Every one of them lost their eyes. I would rather have because our cold weather is not that cold. It gets pretty cold up here compared to where I live now. You know, I grew up here, and I remember coming out of the shower and walking outside and my hair freezing when the wind's blowing. So I know how cold it gets. But I think the bees have a better chance of living with a top deep full of honey, you know, and moving up and moving around. I don't think I've ever had any bees freeze. Most of them either starve or they die from a mite problem. No winter bees. I'd say that's 90% of my losses in the spring. And every hive I've looked at, when somebody calls me to come over, what's wrong with my bees, and I ask them to describe it on the phone, and I say, well, stop, I'm gonna finish it for you, and I can describe everything else that's going on, and that's what it is. So I would put, I like double nukes, and double nukes too for small ones. And what I do with my double nukes is I put them up against the building, just kind of a windbreak for them, and they do fine. They really, I think my losses on double nukes is less than the losses on double bees. And nukes are a great thing to have. That's a great way to start a package. Bees like to be crowded. You know, they build better crowded, they overwinter better crowded. Because if they're not crowded, guess what they got to do with all that space in there? They got to heat it. Do what, Larry?
They gotta maintain.
That's right, and that's why, you know, when you're starting packages and you've got empty frames out here, and they've started on 10 frames, and they say, well, they're not drawing the cold, they're not doing this or whatever. You take that same package and put it in a nuke and crowd them, and let them draw out those 3 or 4 or 5 frames, and then put another box on top, and they'll boom. I bought 10 packages of purebred Russians this year. I had 3 bad queens, the other 7 produced 2 supers of honey apiece because I started them in nukes. And they were 3-pound packages. And I started them on April the 17th of this year. So, you know, crowded bees do better. Any more questions? Well, thank you. I do want to thank you for being beekeepers, you know, to me, because it's all about the honeybees and your interest in bees. And anytime you've got suggestions or you discover something, please let me know. I'm helping another master beekeeper, and we're writing a book, and we're trying to write the book on how to keep bees and understand the system of age-related jobs and how to keep bees in that system so you don't stress them. And if you've got any input, I sure would appreciate it. It would really help me. And I'll analyze it. I'm might not give you credit in the book, but I would appreciate the help.
What's that book on the press?
Who knows? Look at my fingers, I don't type very well. Have you ever tried dictation with B terms?